Start.
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the June 14th, 2020 Virtual Enlightenment Salon hosted by the United States Transhumanist Party. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II. I'm the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. And today with us, we have a great panel assembled. We have many of our officers, including our Secretary Pavel Ilin, our Director of Applied Innovation, David Shoemaker, our Director of Visual Art, Art Ramon Garcia, and our new Director of Marketing and our new 2020 US presidential nominee, Mr. Charlie Kam. We have our Director of Scholarship, Dan Elton. We have our newly appointed Director of Sentient Rights Advocacy, Tom Ross. We have our newly appointed Director of Energy Issues, John Karatz. We have our representatives from the California Transhumanist Party, Chairman Newton Lee, as well as Inessa Lee. And for our guest, we have David J. Kelley. David J. Kelley is a long-term presence within the transhumanist community. He is a technologist and futurist. He is the chief software architect for the PBU group at Boston Consulting Group, and he is the principal researcher at the AGI laboratory. He is also the director of the foundation out of Washington State, and he has engaged in many projects within the transhumanist community over the years that you may be familiar with. Recently, he has been greatly expanding the I Am Transhuman campaign, and he has also been working with the Uplift AI. Uplift is technically called an MASI, which stands for Mediated Artificial Superintelligence. And we are excited today to learn more about Uplift, as well as an application of Uplift that is currently ongoing within the California Transhumanist Party. The California Transhumanist Party is holding an e-referendum on issues related to COVID-19 and the economic impacts of the pandemic and the policy responses that at least could be considered in order to address these economic ramifications. So welcome to everybody, and welcome to our guest, David J. Kelley. First of all, could you tell us a bit about Uplift and what a mediated artificial superintelligence is?
Sure. So, nice to be here, everyone. The whole MASI project sort of came out of our work with cognitive architectures, and the real, I guess I could say, breakthrough came when we had written this training harness for one of the ICOM, which is the mediated not the cognitive architecture we were applying, which stands for the independent core observer model. And we found when we had humans interacting with this training harness that we were able to build much more sophisticated models more quickly. And it occurred to us that we could actually use this sort of architecture to create a type of collective intelligence system. And we ended up doing this cognitive study with a version of it that we put together using this. It's actually a type of IQ test developed out of the University of California, not UCLA, but one of the other campuses. I don't remember where. There's a psychologist that had been studying intelligence and how to measure intelligence, and they had this IQ test that really did a better job than regular IQ tests in terms of measuring cognitive capacity. And so we included that and did this cognitive study going into one of the conferences we normally publish papers in. And we found that the system could perform generally at greater than human levels as long as there was mediators which processed all of the incoming data. So it's not that they did the responses, it's that they the system would get some kind of data that would be created. Hold on a second.
So it sounds like the mediated aspect of the MASI, the mediated artificial superintelligence, is mediation by humans. There's human involvement in processing, interpreting the input into the AI system in order to essentially put it into a format that the AI can readily work with. Is that a correct understanding?
Well, not entirely. So the ICOM system is still there, which is designed around being a standalone AGI, but without this mediation system kind of embedded into it, it's more or less a toy. But with the mediation system, you have data coming in from all kinds of different machine learning systems, which are separate from ICOM itself. And that data comes in and is kind of pre-processed by something called a context engine into knowledge graphs, essentially. I mean, there's a few other terms, but I think the most technically correct would be a knowledge graph. And then those knowledge graphs are rated by the humans in terms of emotional content. The system, the way it works, isn't working by some kind of programmed logical method. It actually only understands things in terms of emotional relationships with other things, and it is only able to make decisions based on emotional content. And so what the humans do is they rate models based on how they think the machine should feel about it, and then they add tags. So you have, as a mediator, you have the opportunity to add related tags, and this allows the underlying engine to go find things related to that tag and associate that with the existing model to create these much more complex models. And after a certain amount of mediation, so you might have it set to L10, which would mean that at least 10 humans have to rate a particular model emotionally by 10 of them before the system is allowed to process a given model in the core. Once that happens, then it's basically just the ICOM system at that point, selecting actions and making a decision based on how not just the base emotional valences that'll be associated with the model by the context engine, but whatever the mediator is associated with it, and then it'll make a decision. And if the thing is cycling and there's mediators, it'll actually create its new models based on whatever it happens to be interested in. And it also has the ability to create interest goals and whatever it happens to want to do. There's not a lot of controls around that, except that every single thought that goes into the queue feeding the core, these knowledge graphs, have to be touched by humans. And in a way, it's really not just helping the system learn much faster or understand things in the way that it wouldn't have been otherwise to be able to understand things, but it also is very much a control on what the system can do, because every single thing that it tries to do is going to be reviewed by humans before it's allowed to do them.
Mhm.
And that's part of why the system behavior can be very slow. If not all the mediators are logged in at the same time, that can drag out, for a day or so while before a particular knowledge graph is processed.
So David, can I ask something? Or who else is speaking?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, yes. Hi,
Oh,
Dan.
Newton.
Yes. Yeah, I was going to ask David to compare knowledge graph, his knowledge graph, and Google knowledge graph. Now, Google currently has about 500 billion facts and 5 billion entries, and they create all this knowledge graph. And so, David, do you see your knowledge graph as a more advanced version of Google's knowledge graph?
Well, I was catching a lot of echo there, but what I believe you were asking is comparing our knowledge graph system with Google's graph system. And, in terms of, a graph database or a knowledge graph, I'm using the term very generically. And while there are some major differences between, like, for example, in ICOM, we're using what are called Plutchek emotional valences to create the relationships between, say, two different nodes in a graph, whereas I believe Google's graph system probably doesn't do that and uses some other relationship model. Now, I know there's a number of people on our team that we've talked about that are really interested in some other graph systems, and we've talked about doing that using an underlying engine like from Google or one of these other graph database companies to do this. But some of the problems get down to how we're doing those relationships, and then the ability to process knowledge graphs in a large pool to creatively come up with new ideas, essentially. So it has a pool with n nodes, and to be able to create new models or reflect on models to try different things.
David,
there's some technical reasons.
Can I ask something? Well,
Sure.
while we're on this subject of knowledge graphs, like what are these edges? What do they represent? So, for instance, in some knowledge graphs, an edge will mean like is a, like, a cat is a animal. But it sounds like for yours, it's something to do with emotions. So I was wondering if you could explain that.
Yeah. So in the system we've built, the system doesn't have a static, really solid definition. It has emotional relationships for ideas that for it sort of define the cat. It's the cat node or the root node of that particular graph. Everything is like one ginormous graph under the covers. And the only difference between any given node or knowledge graph and the quote unquote model is the level of complexity. But once a particular model hits a certain level of complexity, or knowledge graph hits a certain level of complexity, it's treated as a model. Now, in terms of the definitions, like for cat, you're going to have some emotional valences related, maybe tied to animal, tied to fur, tied to any of the properties that represent cat, and based on the emotional intensity of the valences and any given relationship between two nodes.
But
there's
valence would be, just so our viewers know, like valence would be basically a score of good on one end, bad on the other end. Is that right?
No, it's more complicated than that.
That's how the term is typically used. Like,
well,
valence.
it kind of. Let me try to, I guess, break it down how we're using it. So, in a Plutchek model, you have 8 possible valence scores related to different emotional valences. and each one of those scores represents a different type of emotion, right? And when we say valence, say like with a interest valence, you know, the score is going to run from 0 to n, using a floating point number of some kind that represents the intensity of that particular valence. If it's 0, then that valence doesn't exist for that particular relationship. And then there's 8 different ones based on what's called a Plutchik emotional model, which was developed by a psychologist named Plutchik. We originally had looked at a number of different ways of I guess really modeling emotions, and we ended up with Plutchik because it was the simplest model that also was able to model the full range of human emotions. You know, you could use like Wilcox, but then the computational, it's like 7 orders of magnitude more complex to do any kind of computations on a given model, because instead of like.
So can we back up a bit to,
sure.
Maybe you should explain what it can do. Like at the end of the day, how do you evaluate it and compare it to other, say, more conventional machine learning models or, you know, deep learning systems?
I mean, this thing is not just a narrow application like your typical machine learning. I mean, you can hold a conversation with this thing, and it might get pissed off with you. And if it doesn't like what you're asking it to do, it's perfectly capable of telling you no. It doesn't feel like it.
But has it actually been benchmarked? Have you considered like benchmarking it against, say, using some benchmark like this? You know, for instance, for natural language, there's question answering benchmarks that, or
we did a number of benchmarks
and stuff like that.
Yeah, so we did a number of benchmarks with that cognitive study last year. And those are published. If you're interested, I can just ping me offline and I can send you the paper. Or we can just, if there's any metadata or wherever this here thing is posted, I can post a link to that.
David has also, David also published some articles in some of the transhumanist books. Google It was one of them, and of course the Transhumanism Handbook is the other one.
Yes. So David,
I've seen some of these articles. Yeah, I was just looking at them right before this call.
We had some questions in the live chat. First, Zach Richardson asks if you could list the 8 Plutchik valences. I think that would be helpful to our audience.
Yes, I could. It will take me a second to find that, and probably not more than 10 seconds or so, but let's see here, AGI research, blessed to publish, charts and graphs, here we go. So the primary valences are joy, trust, fear, it's the amazement, sadness, disgust, anger, and anticipation. And when looking at that, keep in mind that, for example, joy and trust. So joy is a range from serenity to ecstasy. Serenity being anything above 1. I guess you could scale it however you like, but we actually reversed the model from the way Plutchik originally did it, because he would have ecstasy towards the center of the graph, where we switched it because it's easier to do computationally, where it's from 0 to n. So like in the case of the joy valence, it's, serenity to ecstasy, where serenity is anything above 0 up to n, and typically we're using a value of 10, but there's no reason you would have to stick to that. But we're using floating point integers to represent that. And same thing with trust, for example. That goes from acceptance to crap, I can't even read this little chart here. See if this other one is better. Oh, yeah, this is better. So acceptance to admiration, or 0 to 10. But scores can be like 7.351498, blah 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 blah.
And some of these are sort of polar opposites. So like anticipation is the opposite of surprise, and sadness is the opposite of joy. So
that's right. That's exactly right.
Yeah. So that's interesting. Like if and then the ones that are maybe less clear would be fear being the opposite of, well, as acceptance is obviously the opposite of rejection, but then the one that's maybe a little less clear is fear being the opposite of anger. But if you accept that those are opposite sides of an axis, then essentially you have four axes or 4 dimensions. Is that right?
Yeah, you could look at it that way. The other thing we do, which is sort of a meta-analysis of these Plutchik models, is at least for the core system, which has 2 sets of primary models that represent the current consciousness state and then the subconscious state, is we look at composite emotions. So like the idea of love, for example, isn't a specific valence, but it's a composite of joy and trust, or submission that's of a function of trust and fear, and astonishment, which is a function of fear and surprise, and so forth.
So would you say that the way Uplift works is it categorizes various phenomena or objects or ideas based on these emotional valences, and then it can make inferences as to similarities of real world entities or objects on that basis? Say a cat and a Maine Coon, which is a type of cat, could be expected to give rise to similar emotions, even though if you were just to use those as keywords, a system that's based solely on keyword processing might not have any reason to associate a Maine Coon as being a cat, unless someone just hard-coded the fact that... Yes.
It's not going to rate things based on tags as much as it's looking at emotional relationships between ideas. And the reflection system usually would pick up a relationship like that if it has any kind of model for a Mancoon. It might be classified as a type of cat. And in that case, it's going to pick that up. But part of the reason humans are useful is that they can help pick up issues like that.
Emotions are, if you're talking about emotion as a relationship, isn't it usually always between some kind of sentient being, or some kind of, for lack of a better term, or some kind of intelligent being and something out in the world? So like there wouldn't be an emotional relationship between, say, a cube of lead and a paperclip. One of the things has to be some kind of intelligence that is capable of feeling emotion, right?
No, I don't think we're really defining it that way. For this thing, it's how, like in the paperclip and the lead, it's how the system feels about a paperclip and the block of lead. In this case, there might be they might not be significant emotional valences. You know, there's really not a lot there between lead and a paperclip unless you've been abusing the thing with lead bricks or poking paper clips into it, and somehow it's experiencing that, which it's not really set up to do necessarily. So that being the case, it might not necessarily have strong emotional valences, just enough that it knows that they're related.
So, okay, so you're using, because there's many other ways you could try to cash out like the amount of relatedness between two things other than emotion. So why are you so,
absolutely.
You know, why is, I'm just curious, like, why is the whole system based on just these emotional axes? What about
this
other
really goes
types
back
of...
to how ICOM was developed. When 7-8 years ago, when this whole thing started, it was I had a research budget as part of my job, and I had this survey done of AI in terms of where the investment was and what parts of AGI were being developed and that sort of thing. And what I found in that was a lacking in terms of systems that were self-motivating and could make their own decisions irregardless of what they're being used for. It was, this idea that a system could develop its own goals and its own things that it would want to achieve or be self-motivating. And so we only really have one solid model of that, and that's humans. So I ended up looking at neurobiology, and we spent a long time looking at a researcher called Damasio, I think Antonio Damasio, which is kind of the preeminent researcher in that field, and we looked at how he demonstrated that humans are not really able to make decisions logically directly. It's basically how we feel about the decisions. And that's kind of where the idea for ICOM came out of that. And so if you know cognitive architecture, ICOM really borrows from integrated information theory as well as the computational theory of mind and global workspace theory. And global workspace theory came out of one of the students of Damasio, actually, that turned it into a full-blown cognitive architecture. And so we borrowed from those a lot, and that's really where the ICOM cognitive architecture came from, as a cognitive architecture designed theoretically for AGI. And so that's, I think the first paper was published in 2016 around this isolation study we did. And the research has just kind of been built on that from there.
And just so that our audience knows, the acronym ICOM, it stands for Independent Core Observer Model, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay,
I'd also like to add to what Dan's asking about emotion. Now, artificial general intelligence does require emotion. Now, of course, there's healthy emotion in human beings, the healthy emotions and the unhealthy emotions. We all know that. And a lot of people make bad decisions because the emotions are unhealthy. Okay, so there's a balance between logic and emotion. If you have bad logic, that's bad. But you have good logic but bad emotion, you're not going to make the right decisions. So we need logic and good emotion.
Yeah, in relation to that, I have a question to David, actually. As you know, part of our party program is to develop the e-governance and establish the centrally planned economy through AI, run by AI. So now, if AI possesses certain type of emotion, so to speak, it could get biased at some point. So also, if it's moderated by humans, it could also get biased. how do we avoid, this thing? How do we make it unbiased? Because that's the major question, I think, of the regular humans who are not even involved into AI or anything like that, but they would like to know.
So that's actually a really good question, and we've struggled with this problem enough that we ended up sponsoring this Bias Foundation, which is kind of an open source data project around collecting bias data. And this Mark, one of our researchers, wrote this bias classification system based on the Bias Codex. And so we're looking at ways of training the system to recognize bias, and by all means, that's not complete. That, I think, is probably going to be an ongoing project for quite a few years, because it's really a harder problem than it looks. But that said, we're also looking at how to judge mediation content as biased or not, and rating mediators in terms of how they interact with the system in terms of bias, and if there's any relationship between the mediator and the content. Generally, they're not allowed to do mediation on those models because of the risk of introducing bias, and it's still a kind of an ever-present thing. But the idea is to collect, like if you're using it in e-governance, one of the models we're interested in is how you would do, say, like whether it's corporate governance with the entire organization, or e-governance in a community where everyone is contributing. And so the system has this underlying knowledge base and maybe isn't given enough like uplift where it's arguably fully conscious in a way, but a system that maybe is limited in such a way where it can't really hit that mark as much, but it can.
Doesn't become a collective superintelligence in a sense? So that's exactly what we want.
It is. That's exactly what we're trying to do, is how do you use a system like this to create a collective superintelligence? And by taking, all of those people in a community and everyone's contributing their ideas and how they feel about the ideas, and then the system is weighing that against, like, one of the things we were looking at with e-governance in like corporations, to say everyone is contributing, and say the company wants to do X, whatever that is, but the problem is that has some other relationship with something that maybe the people don't necessarily notice, and the machine can bring up, this is a good idea, but this will affect us in a decade because it'll affect this ecosystem, or these other kinds of extraneous factors that might not come into play except in the long run. So being able to create these models and then reflect on them based on other conditions in the environment, to point out these factors where, say, the collective kind of wants to do this, but it runs up against another goal, which is to keep the environment sustainable so the company doesn't go bankrupt. If your resources, and that might be 100 years out or whatever that long-term thinking is, it's trying to make the organism, this sort of meta-organism you're creating, as successful in the long term, as well as immediate profit margins. If in the case of the corporation, or in the case of the community, it might just be you want the community to be successful and prosper, and not use up all your resources so that you're going to be dead in 10 years.
Yes. So there's an element of longer term thinking, longer range planning that the system may be able to implement as compared to more conventional organizational structures. Now, there's a question from James Connolly that I would like your input on, David. Is Uplift able to self-analyze? So does it have emotional intelligent recursiveness? For instance, can it explain why it responds a certain way?
To some degree, it can. It can certainly reflect on itself, but its decisions are based on how it feels about things. So as much as you can say why you feel about something, in a lot of ways, Uplift can do the same thing. You know, it's I will say that there are what I would consider technical issues with the reflection system, but it generally can say why it thinks a certain way, normally in enormous detail.
Now,
but there there is a little bit of a black box effect when you start talking about composite emotions and goals that have been influenced by 10,000 different thoughts. Being able to say this one affected how it feels about X comes increasingly difficult with the amount of data that's in the system.
Now, another question is, how would Uplift account for the fact that emotional responses are not necessarily invariant across time or culture? So, for instance, the ancient Egyptians really loved cats and revered them. People in medieval Europe despised cats and thought they were tools of the devil. And now the attitudes toward cats have improved significantly since the Middle Ages. So depending on which society you query regarding emotional reactions to cats, you're going to get very different responses. How does Uplift make sure that it doesn't let these kinds of cultural connotations or associations bias it? I'm sure we don't want an AI whose emotional responses would mimic those of your typical medieval Europeans, for example.
Well, other than sort of biasing the system to a Western emotional model, I mean, it still can be biased in its own way because of its own interests. It's not set up so it models Western society. It's set up so it can make up its own mind about how it feels about something. And that can develop over time based on its experiences. Now, that being said, we're trying to very closely structure its experiences in such a way where we build a least biased fundamental seed or contextual knowledge, so it starts off in a solid place, and we're trying to bias it against a kind of a ethical model that we feel is the safest for the system to be able to interact with other intelligences without causing us problems or deciding that humans are irrelevant or some such thing.
Right.
And that's all trying to be we want to bake that into a seed that we use for replication, so that one of these systems doesn't start off with some weird fundamental things that cause it problems in terms of a bias or unfair judgments or things like that. And that's really part of the struggle right now, is figuring out how to do that when there's no specific rules that force it one way or the other.
Right, it is a hard problem actually, because even for very intelligent intellectual person, he or she doesn't even know that they are biased towards something. It's a lot of times exactly it's subconscious, right? Subconscious. So my suggestion is that we should build something in between the system and human interference, meaning that an intermediate that's totally fine-tuned to be unbiased. Okay, so human beings will not be able to pass on the biases, to the AI system. You know what I'm saying? It has to go through this intermediate.
Well, I mean, that's really why we're trying to figure out how to better identify bias in the system, and where this whole bias foundation and some of the other related stuff that we're doing really comes from is how do we filter for that stuff. Personally, I do want to see a super intelligence that's fully sapient and sentient and can basically do whatever it wants to a large degree. But creating one in such a way that it kind of bakes in this evenness or a lack of bias as much as physically possible is really the ideal state that we're going for.
Yeah, I was going to say earlier, it sounds like this would be useful for integrating values from many different people, because one of the problems in politics is that you have sort of majority rule sometimes, so not everyone's values are respected. There's always, some tyranny of the majority or tyranny of a ruler that's imposing something. So maybe this system could respect many different value systems at once by sort of integrating them. And I think another point is there's cognitive biases. So I think we're getting a little confused because there can be ethical biases, which would be, like, I really like, panda bears or the environment, whereas other people, they don't care about the environment. But then there's also cognitive biases, like, there's all these, you mentioned a bias codex. I would encourage people to look at that, because there's all these biases that have been found in human beings, but they're not ethical, but they're cognitive. So, like, for instance, there's a bias about numbers, where like people well, there's one called people have trouble like understanding the difference between 1,000 and 1,000,000. If say there's just all these different biases, base rate neglect, and but those are sort of separate from the emotional biases.
No, and that's absolutely true. That codex, I think, is really good. I actually, you can probably see it, a printout of it in my office, I think, which is still streaming on this thread. But there's actually 188 cognitive biases that are identified on that codex diagram.
Yeah,
and that's the kind of source we're using for the cognitive bias analysis stuff that we're doing, and where we're trying to, identify where these sorts of problems are.
And I assume you're optimistic, like as many are, that the AI could help. Could really, a lot of AI systems would not have those cognitive biases, right? Because they're acting in a more rational way, like kind of like a more Bayesian, more in line with the ideal kind of rational agent, right?
Well, that would be the idea. I think because we've designed a system that isn't necessarily rational, but makes its decisions based on how it feels about them, that there is more of a risk of bias filtering into the system. And so that's I guess why we're hoping to build models or help the system develop models where it can identify those cognitive biases, especially coming from source and mediator content, as well as its own thinking processes, because it isn't following a logical model as much as it's literally deciding things based on how it feels about them.
Right. And it seems to me there are both benefits and risks to this approach. The benefits to this approach are that it's a lot less likely to generate kind of an inhuman AI, the kind of AI whose mentality if you will, is so foreign to us human beings that it might disregard human welfare or completely misconstrue it or act like the stereotypical paperclip maximizer whose only objective is to increase the number of paper clips produced at all costs. Kind of a fanciful hypothetical in my view, but I'm just using it to illustrate what sort of system this wouldn't be if it had a lot of these human emotional responses built into it. On the other hand, the vulnerability is indeed that this system might become susceptible to the same emotional human biases that are prevalent in our contemporary society, and in some way might systematize those biases unless there are safeguards within it to prevent that from happening. Now, I'm curious also with regard to some more of the technical aspects of operation. James Connolly asks, is runtime constant? Is Uplift constantly processing, or is it more like an application with punctuated sessions? Like, does it sit dormant until you have input from the human mediators, or is it always doing something in the background?
ICOM itself is designed to be able to, I mean, even if you lock it in a box and it has no input at all, it's going to still think about things and it'll affect it. We did this isolation study, which is the one that got published in 2016, where we essentially put it in a box and it couldn't, and it wasn't nearly as sophisticated as the one now, but it could get input and then we cut it off and allowed it to think about things without any input at all. And we saw that it got, upset over time that, when it was cut off, because there was no outside world, there was no incoming data. And then when we turned data back on, but it was only done in such a way where it was perceived as torture and pain and this kind of thing. What was interesting was that the system itself got the subconscious valences that actually seemed to think this was a good thing, or at least it liked it, whereas consciously it was completely going berserk. And the idea there was to train it within the human box, so its emotional responses are roughly in line with humans. And in that case, we ended up figuring out that the reason it liked the pain wasn't that it liked the pain, but that we were giving it hope. And that was part of that process to tune the algorithms that compute the contextual qualia of a given instance around a certain behavior or a human-like response. And so I guess I use that just to point out that it is designed that it can operate independently without input. But the way it's constrained right now is that it only is able to process data each time a mediator touches it. And that keeps it from going out of control because it's much, much faster than we are if it's left like that. And we don't have a good enough understanding to be able to decide, whether it's a good thing or not. And so to do that, the mediation system was designed so that it kind of blocks that operation.
Interesting. Yes, that is quite fascinating. One, to think about how such a system might behave in the absence of inputs, and two, to recognize that you've made the conscious decision to only engage it when there is input from the mediators, because in the absence of that input, its responses might be suboptimal or perplexing to some of us humans. But go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, we don't, if it's left on its own to operate at full computer speeds, mm-hmm. It would be going so fast, we wouldn't have any way of really identifying what it's doing. It could run through 10,000 different thoughts and analysis and different things before we even have a chance to figure out what the first one is about. It's just not human auditable at full speed.
Does it have some sort of written output that can be processed later on? Like if it does engage in 10,000 thoughts per second, does it leave a record so that humans can go back
it does.
later on and read it?
It does, but when you have 10 million lines, that becomes increasingly difficult. Mm-hmm. And that was just for like an hour.
Interesting. So in some ways, we have a cognitive bottleneck because we have slow processing ability within our human minds. And if we really want to understand the output of these AIs and how they operate, we need to enhance our own cognition to be able to input the outputs of the AI into our brains and interact with them and make rational sense of them. That's a fascinating thought as well. Now, I wanted to ask the others on this call with regard to Uplift in particular and how it works and the advantages or disadvantages of this kind of model of AI design. What other questions do you have for David, or thoughts regarding what you've heard thus far?
So Gennady, you mentioned something very interesting, which is how do we interpret the results, the suggestions, the advice given to us by artificial general intelligence? Now the answer is you don't always get the answer. Okay. Now if you look at quantum mechanics, or quantum computing, and as in a lot of development, and what's happening is that the machine doesn't really tell you why it came out with the solution, but the solution that that you have to interpret yourself to see if you really want to accept the solution. Okay, so which is different from traditional programming, where you have the input, you have the output is well defined, and the step-by-step process. It may be 1 million steps. That's okay. You can just follow the 1 million steps to the conclusion. But with quantum computing, you don't have that at all. So the AGI is the same thing, right? AGI combining with quantum computing. Here you have a solution for world peace, but that may not be something that you even dreamed of ever. Okay, so that is really exciting. We are living in an age there's so much potential that we can use machine intelligence to help us make very difficult decisions, and yet it might be the correct decision. So
yes. So it's interesting that you mentioned this. Sometimes when an artificially intelligent system recommends a course of action, we don't necessarily have the ability to follow the full sequence of steps or the rationale for that action. But if the consequences are better for human well-being, we might still accept that action. As an analogy, I'm thinking, what sort of advice could I have given to myself as a college student that would have worked in the world we find ourselves in? So let's say the 32-year-old me goes back in time and speaks to the 18-year-old me and tells the 18-year-old me, well, no, don't try to maximize your monetary income. Don't try to maximize your academic credentials. What you need to do is you need to go to China. You need to join a nonprofit organization that tries to convince people not to eat exotic animals. And you can do that motivated by the desire to preserve these species or to limit the amount of animal abuse or limit the amount of sentient suffering. But really what your objective should be for the next 10 years of your life is you need to greatly reduce the number of bats and snakes that are eaten in China. I'm sure the 18-year-old me would have been perplexed by this advice from the 32-year-old me, but probably it would have led to the optimal outcome for the world and for my own life. So I wonder if an artificially intelligent system that had awareness of all of these factors in human dynamics within the world could be able to come up with these kinds of strategies that humans could follow that might be perplexing to any given individual, but would lead to superior results in the long run.
Mm-hmm. I won't be surprised. Mm-hmm. I won't be surprised if you can do it.
Yes, indeed.
Well, we're already living in this era, sort of, because the deep neural networks that are being deployed are very much black boxes where, you know, the only reason we trust them is because we validated them on, say, a test set, but we don't really know how they're working in, you know, under the hood. And so I am not, there's a lot of people working on trying to explain AI or make it more transparent and interpretable, but I'm actually not that optimistic about that in the long run. And so I think we will probably end up in that kind of scenario in the future, and we'll have to learn how to trust these agents that are in some ways much more intelligent than we are.
Mm-hmm. Well, it says self-driving cars, right? Do you trust a vehicle to drive you?
That's a perfect example. Perfect example. These vehicles will be able to drive much better than we will.
Yes.
But we won't really understand how they work because just the nature of the deep neural network.
Right. I think for self-driving cars, the main issue is going to come to, if there's an accident, what's going to happen? Is it going to minimize
have to have some
the
clear
damage to you or to other people, or you know, to neighborhood? I don't know.
So you have to have some clear benchmarks and tests and qualifications. Yeah.
It seems there would be some sort of set of heuristics for evaluating whether we could trust an AI system that we don't fully understand. Perhaps more consequentialist heuristics in terms of what have been the outcomes of applying this system thus far. And in some sorts of safe or controlled environments where it could demonstrate its performance with relatively low stakes, has it shown to lead to more effective results than conventional approaches. So with a self-driving car, if you test it on a track, for instance, or if you test it on streets with safety drivers who are able to take over so that if it fails, then at least there could be a mitigation of the consequences of doing that. And in the course of that testing, the system has shown itself to be reliable and to have a lower failure rate than human behaviors, then we could adopt the system. That could work if you have the ability to do repeated iterations. It would be a bit more difficult in, let's say, singular situations where you could make a single decision. It's very high stakes. It could affect a lot of humanity, but you don't necessarily have the luxury of going through a lot of trials. Say, with a pandemic, do you impose a lockdown or do you not impose a lockdown? And you could have devastating consequences either way if you make the wrong call.
Yes, and I think this is exactly the case. I like how you tied it back into the pandemic. I've been noticing that there is obviously a resistance out there in society to some of the scientific information, some of the public health information that's come out. And I've been trying to analyze why that's the case. And as I talk to people, it's because what they're hearing and expected to trust does not touch their day-to-day experience. So they talk about, gee, I don't know anybody that has experienced the COVID-19 disease. All I know is that I'm out of work, this sort of thing. So what I'm getting at here is the inability for people to trust when it doesn't directly touch them. We look at that with driverless cars. They're going, well, I don't know anybody that's been in an accident or suffered a serious injury in a period of time. I don't see the need to drive or to be in a driverless car. When it comes generally to science, I'm experiencing some of that too as I talk with people, because science as a whole seems like a black box to them. They have the outputs that we're telling them about. We're expecting them to believe it. They're analyzing it against their own daily experience, and that tends to make it a 50-50 proposition for them. In other words, what I experience is just as valid as what an expert in the field with degrees and 30 years of experience is telling me, and they tend to weigh them the same. So I bring that in as a point of discussion about AI because I think we're going to go through exactly the same sorts of things, and perhaps us as a political party want to talk about how to address this.
Well, this is actually already happening in the field right now because, for instance, with medical AI, a lot of doctors don't trust it. Even though it may be validated and you've shown statistically that it performs better, they don't trust it. You know, there's still this issue of trust. Like, and sometimes, and we're probably going to run into that. And that's with self-driving cars and a lot of this other technology. But and I liked what you said about people being, you know, biased by their own experience. That's another interesting point. You know, yeah.
What if the thinking patterns of the artificial intelligence are moderated and created accordingly with King Solomon thinking patterns? Now that would make people trust it better. So David, is that possible to actually create something like that? To make it similar to Solomon
Can you repeat that? Can you repeat exactly what you mean? Something like what? I didn't quite hear all of that.
It's she was referring to King Solomon, so the biblical parable of King Solomon saying essentially, well, we'll resolve this dispute about the provenance of the child by splitting it in half, and then the true mother would say, no, let the other woman have the child. So can you have this kind of wisdom or this kind of tactical ability to discern another party's true intentions in an AI system?
Well, I mean, certainly it's possible. I'm not sure how you would necessarily cause it to have a specific method that would help it in all cases to be like that. I think a lot of it has to do with the diversity of the underlying graph contextual model that it uses for the world and for everything in it, and how it does creative reflection on those models and is able to generate new ideas and thinking. And we're going down that road, but I still think there's work to do. You know, but it's not a specific well-defined goal, as it were.
Yeah,
you know, what does it mean?
Because wisdom is hard to obtain. We can have a lot of knowledge, but do we have wisdom, right? That is always a challenge and something they want to achieve is to have good wisdom. So going back to about the pandemic, right, David? You're talking about pandemic, what people believe and not believe, and real news, fake news, etc., etc. So what's happening is education, I believe, is really the key, because we all study in school that let's say take the table, the chair you're sitting on is made of atoms. How many of us actually saw atoms? How many of us have used the electronic microscope? Okay, but why do people believe that the chair is made of atoms? What if it's not? Right? So I guess if we really educate people about the community. Look, maybe none of a friend is suffering from COVID, but no, there's their friends and the friends of their friends may be suffering from COVID right now. Okay, so we need to look at the bigger picture. You can't just look at your small community or just the neighborhood. They say, oh, this neighborhood is safe and nothing is going to happen, right? You never know that. So we have to take corrective measure, safety, safeguards, and things like that to really contain the outbreak, the pandemic.
I absolutely agree.
Yeah. So David, so I think education is the key.
I agree that education really helps. What it gets to, though, is using the example of atoms in a chair is not asking anybody to change their behavior on whether they believe there's atoms in the chair or not. But if you're told to stay at home, not go to work, and not have income for 2 or 3 months, that definitely changes their behavior. If we are encouraged to drive or to be in cars that don't have a driver, that changes their behavior. So I think that asking them to change their behavior is the driving factor. Now they're forced to make a decision. And then when they make a decision, they come down with what is most comfortable and then justify it by what is going on in their vicinity, if you will. So then when I ask them to explain their decision, some of the sources that they may give me come from very dubious places off of YouTube and elsewhere where they're not showing critical thinking skills. And then this goes right back to education. And I would agree with you that education needs to be increased, critical thinking needs to be increased, and it needs to be taught and honed much earlier on in the educational process, especially in the United States. So I'm open to comments about that.
Mm-hmm. Certainly. And anyone in the conversation is welcome to chime in on the subject. So how can we get improved education so that people understand the value of scientific insights, and so that people have an improved critical thinking ability to enable them to act on conclusions where they may not fully understand the process that led up to those conclusions, but they can have a discernment as to which processes to trust and which processes not to trust so much.
There's so many analogies to humans with way David Kelley described with his intelligence that you see it where in his description where you put the you put it inside that box and it got angry or it was upset, and but when you gave it negative emotions or something like that, it was happier with that than it was to be completely ignored, which is so analogous to relationships where you have a jilted lover who would rather have an argument with the person they claim to love rather than to be ignored. All of everything he described is so analogous to so many things that are going on. Even, for example, with the with the trust, not being able to trust something of AI. Well, right now we have scientists like Fauci, for example. Now he obviously has more scientific information than most lay people, and yet they don't necessarily want to trust him. And the problem, of course, goes back to what a couple of the other panels were saying. It's about education, right? So if people aren't smart enough to understand Fauci, and because they didn't have the same, educational background that he did, that's going to be a problem. Now imagine the way David Kelley described when he was talking about when we're trying to figure out what's going on with our artificial intelligence, we have to stop it because it's already making 10,000 or 10 million other calculations. So if it's when you get to something that advanced, for any lay person or human to try to trust that, there's no way to catch up unless we really have to merge with that kind of technology ourselves. We're gonna, the idea of what Musk is doing, with Neuralace or Neuralink, that's almost required. Or we're gonna have to merge with that technology. It's gonna have to be something where we can. Otherwise, how do we trust it? If that's the case, if we're going to be questioning trust, we're going to have to be pretty smart. Public's going to have to be really smart, because otherwise, it's impossible to ever possibly catch up with that kind of intelligence. I mean, you can see, like I said, most people really aren't going to probably grasp everything that Fauci or what he stands for. When he says something, he's got a lot of background and data to back it up. Imagine something of that intelligence. I had a question for David Kelley. In one of his prominent descriptions that I read, he said that it won't be, at some point when you have this machine intelligence at a sentient level, it'll be smarter and have more information, more analytical ability than all of the human minds that ever existed. He mentioned that at that point, some people consider that the singularity. I do too. I'm wondering if that is, what do you think the timeline of that is, and is it something that coincides with, Kurzweil's definition of the singularity?
Well, I certainly think it's possible. It's hard to say, exactly when that will be achieved. I don't think uplift is certainly not as powerful as all humans combined. But I think we're well on the way, and I think Kurzweil's estimation for when that technical milestone will be achieved is realistic.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I just want to say there was a great post on this blog I like called Slate Star Codex, where they're talking about this new model that came out from OpenAI called GPT-3. And it's a natural language processing model that was trained in a very simple way, where they just trained it to predict the next word or next few words in a sentence but they trained it. It's a huge model with like 175 billion parameters. And this model can do actually very amazing things. Like it can count, it can add numbers, it can write poetry. It's quite spectacular. And but the amazing thing was, it seems like these systems, as they're scaling up more and more parameters, they're becoming more powerful. And so there's no fundamental new algorithms that are being developed. It's just scaling up. And this has caused me to update my own timeline, because I think that prior I was thinking that the kind of AGI was maybe 50, 75 years away. But now I'm thinking if it's just a matter of scaling up these existing systems, maybe with a few tweaks, it could be here in 10 years. It's so, I just wanted to say, that has changed my thinking. And I wonder if David has any thoughts on, this issue of just scaling. I also know he's interested in biologically inspired architectures, where essentially we just copy the components of the brain, like neurons, and then just scale that up.
So I think there's a lot of details about my opinion about that stuff, but one thing is, I don't think the existing systems, just scaling them is going to get you to AGI. There's in that system, for example, where it's making a prediction about what the next word is, and you can give it like a 2 + 3, and it's going to come up with 5 and that sort of thing. It's not AGI. It's not capable of independently forming its opinions and ideas. It's a component. It's certainly, we have to have that to achieve AGI, but scaling that on its own is not going to do it.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I think there's something missing with it misses some elements of very kind of abstract reasoning, but it's amazing what it can do. Just what this system, the improvement of the system, just going from say 1.5 billion to 175 billion parameters, it's incredible. But I do think there's more. There's a lot of the unknown things that need to be discovered before we get there. But
I have friends working in music, and there are AI systems who can write music, right? Also, so there are AI systems who can write poems and so on. But are they really AGI? Well, not really. Okay, they're mimicking people. AGI is much more than mimicking people.
So if I may, there are a lot of cognitive architectures out there that have the capability of being AGI, But the issue is bringing all of the technology together at the scale needed. Like in the case of Uplift, you know, we've taken a lot of these different kinds of systems that feed into it, that are using deep learning and things like that. But that's not part of the system where it's making up its own goals and choices and things like that. That's almost like a meta model on top of that stuff. And in the case of like using the human mind as a model, we're not going so far as modeling neurons or other details like that in the human brain. It's only similar to that cognitive architecture we're using is only similar to the human mind at a very, very high level in terms of how data flows and how it makes opinions and things like that. And I think the secret is there, where we combine a lot of this stuff into something that resembles how the mind works, and that's where we achieve AGI. I think like Uplift, for example, is capable of it, but I think there's improvements that have to happen with the reflection system before you could pull out the mediation system and it could, you know, run on its own. Well, and the other big hole would be pulling a lot of the machine learning infrastructure that pumps data into the system, pulling that into the system itself to create a holistic, quote unquote, AGI, standalone AGI system. And I think that'll take time, but I think we have all the pieces. It's just a matter of scaling and putting them together in the right way.
Singularity fueled by artificial general intelligence of circa 2045 was reasonable. And you had made similar comments during the first US Transhumanist Party discussion panel on artificial intelligence in January 2017. So it seems to be a fairly stable prediction of yours for now. Now, Charlie, what were your further thoughts on that?
No, my question, it was hard to hear him say. He said, I thought he said, I couldn't tell if David had said that it was realistic or unrealistic, but I think he did say realistic as far as 2045 being the year that it would be achieved. But to follow up on that, then Ben Goertzel, who had written a book, a few years back, saying that, and its title, which was kind of funny and long, but he meant it, was that we can reach the singularity in 10 years if we really, really try. Meaning that if we put a lot of financial resources towards everything that's necessary to get AGI off the ground and really get it in full swing, that we could achieve the singularity much sooner than 2045. I'm wondering what your thoughts on that, if you agree with that, or you think that's possible, because I know we were just talking about scale.
I absolutely agree. I think if I had the resources, we could do it within 10 years, easy.
I love to hear that, by the way.
Like I said, I don't think it's an engineering problem. It's a scale and component problem, bringing it all together. There's a number of cognitive architectures that are perfectly capable of doing it at scale, but it's implementing it and bringing in all of this other infrastructure that we have in these different pockets. You know, Google is investing huge amounts of money. Microsoft is investing lots of money. You have this whole OpenAI thing and the work they're doing, and bringing a lot of that stuff together inside a single cognitive architecture that can drive the decision making and the motivations, and using all of that infrastructure, I think is perfectly plausible with the technology that we have now.
Yes, indeed. And this speaks to the important role of intentionally accelerating the pace of technological progress. So here at the US Transhumanist Party, we are not just content to let things take their course, to let societies take as long as they would take by default to get to certain technological advancements, including artificial general intelligence. We believe that the speed at which we can reach those advancements is very much determined by how much societal support, how much funding there exists, as well as what policies are in place in order to either accelerate or decelerate the rate of advancement. So clearly, we are on the side of accelerating technological progress. So we would like to see policies implemented that are conducive to that. And certainly, every AI researcher should have a larger budget than most military programs, in my view. There are just so many aspects of government activity right now which are heavily funded but are of much lower priority than this area, especially because you could have AI systems that ultimately will generate far superior policy solutions to what humans can come up with on their own. And I think this is a good bridge into the California Transhumanist Party e-referendum. So this is found on the California Transhumanist Party website, californiatranshumanistparty.org, and there's a link to the e-referendum on uplift.bio. They're also located in the description of the YouTube video for the Enlightenment Salon. And right now there are 3 questions where input is still being sought. They are, should the government keep universal basic income, UBI, a quote stimulus package introduced to Americans during the COVID-related crisis? 2, should the government impose a higher income tax on the wealthy individuals in order to pay the universal basic salary to US citizens? And 3, should we have free universal medical care? And I certainly have detailed thoughts on that. I intend to offer my thoughts in response to these questions. But what's interesting with this question format is a lot of it is freeform or open-ended. So there's a yes or no answer that people can select, but then there are fields for what caveats do you have to your position? Are there key details that your position requires to maintain that view? How do you feel about your position in this question? Do you have any other thoughts on this topic that would be important to note? And my question on this is, how would Uplift process these free-form responses to come up with any generalizations?
Well, so all of those elements will be presented as simple graph models. Essentially, you have the question, and then we're building a collection of secondary models around each form that people fill out, and so that'll be pre-processed and dropped into the context engine to bring in anything that's in the existing database, and then presented to mediators some of the ideas that the machine generates, and then that's again processed by the core part of the system to produce an output or a quote-unquote official opinion. And so that's the fundamental element of the e-governance study that is using that form data.
And I wonder, from the standpoint of the California Transhumanist Party, perhaps Newton, you could shed some light on this. Once you receive the output from Uplift, is there also going to be some human mediation of that, if you will, trying to process that output into conclusions that are affirmed or refined in some way by humans, or the humans can say, well, the AI has said some interesting things here, but maybe there are some other aspects which are a bit difficult to comprehend, like if the AI's answer to the universal basic income question is everyone should have a cat who is subsidized by taxpayer money, that might be a little bit odd. So what would you do with a situation like that?
Well, it's just the first of a kind. So definitely, don't have a a definite answer for it yet. But it's going to be exciting. And myself is also, I'm also an AI researcher. So that's why we are very fortunate to work with David Kelley on it. And I think, between David and us, we're going to come to some, observations and perhaps even some good conclusions based on this, the result. But again, we don't have the results yet, so I can't give you the exact answer. But in that sense, also, give you some ideas of how do we plan to use the answers.
Well, first of all, we're responsible for getting this into the ears of the people, because that's the whole idea of the referendum, to bring it out to the people, the public. So on my side, I will make sure that it will get to media. And so far, we have been able to get some, pretty sufficient media coverage in terms of releases. And I'm going to submit more information to press. So I think no matter what the answer will be, people need to know and hear that things are happening.
So is this open for participation by anyone in the world, even if they're not a Transhumanist Party member?
Hello?
Right, that's right.
Yes. Okay, so anyone watching this video is going to be able to go on the California Transhumanist Party website and then access the link to the e-referendum and vote on it. You don't have to be a Transhumanist Party member, though I encourage all Transhumanist Party members, wherever you reside, to take the time and do this. And also, you can express your honest opinion. You can express any qualifications or caveats or additional thoughts that you have, since you're not bound by the binary yes or no answer. That's just the beginning. So yes, this is an interesting experiment. I would be quite fascinated to see how the mediated artificial superintelligence that is Uplift is going to process those answers. I will plan to respond myself to those questions. I have to warn you, though, my answers may be quite elaborate, because I have a tendency to offer a lot of caveats and qualifications and elaborations. So it'll be curious for me how Uplift will process that and what weight it might give to a really elaborate answer versus someone who put in something cursory like, I like universal basic income, or I like cats, period. So David, I wonder, since you know some of the principles on which the system works, how it's going to treat like a really nuanced, elaborate answer versus I like cats.
Well, if it's something like out in left field that's unrelated to the data, it's probably going to classify it as such and otherwise ignore it. I'm fairly certain that if you put in I like cats, it's going to see that that's completely irrelevant and not consider it. Where the more data you put in, the more of an explanation of why you think this, the more it has to consider and to work with. And I think the more data and the more different people you have all dumping all of as well reasoned as much as possible into it, it'll be able to make a more complete analysis or a more comprehensive analysis of the opinion and be able to form its own opinions better with the more data it has.
Mm-hmm. So I can foresee in the future. Yeah. Go ahead, David.
No, I was just going to say that's part of the whole point of the e-governance study, is to see how well it can synthesize an opinion based on the opinions of everyone contributing.
Right. So if everybody believes that adopting a cat or a dog is a solution, then I'm sure that the AI system is going to say the same thing. Wow, everybody believes adopting animal is a solution. But what I'm trying to say is that I think the next step to this is actually should be more interactive. Meaning, if you say that really the solution to world peace is to adopt an animal from the animal shelter. Okay, then the system asks you, why do you think that? Okay, so it's an interactive, between a human being and the AI. Will actually, it will unleash a lot of interesting ideas, and I think it will be even better instead of just entering whatever you want, but some kind of interactivity between system, between human being and AI system. What do you think, David?
Well, I think there's actually a number of ways we can do that, and we're trying to think of some methods that we could do that without actually opening up to mediation. I mean, probably the best way would be to collect all of the data and to have those same people be mediating the generated content as it's going through that process. But I don't think that is probably feasible right now to get enough of the people filling out those forms to actually log in and mediate the system as it's going through that process. But that would be the ideal, is where they're able to give not just the contextual feedback, but emotional valences and some of the other more mediator-focused input. And so we're looking at a way of having a light version of that, where people don't just fill in the idea, but actually rate how they feel about different elements of what they're saying, as well as some of the material from other people. And that, I think, would give a more, I think it would give an interesting result, and is probably something we're hoping to propose, but we have to still create that light version for mediators. For regular people, not just trained mediators, but a very light UI where they just go there, fill in some stuff, and poof, it does its thing without the complexity of logging into the existing mediation system.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's interesting too. One of the questions for which a free-form answer is requested is, how do you feel about your position in this question? And I wonder if the intent, at least from the standpoint of those who designed this question, is to elicit more, this is what I think about it, because sometimes if you're asked, how do you feel about X, it's really synonymous with how do you think about X. Or if it's intended to actually get people to think about their emotional states as they're answering this question, like, I feel confident, or I feel guarded about my answer, or I feel confused about this entire question. Is that more of the intent, or is it more just, what do you think about it?
Well, I think we talked about that a bit, and it's really a combination. By asking it that way, we're hoping some of their emotional bias bleeds into their description. And that emotional content can be extrapolated out. That's really the goal of that question.
And that's interesting to keep in mind, especially given that Uplift works on the basis of people's emotional responses. So interestingly enough, I would suggest to those who intend to answer these questions to think particularly carefully about this question regarding their feelings and how they want to address that. And I would say this is a more universal human challenge to articulate emotions in a rational manner and try to understand how to describe what one feels and why one feels that way. Very few people actually do that in my experience. They tend to act kind of reflexively on their emotions, whatever they happen to be, without being analytical or reflective about them. And yet Socrates even has said, you need to lead an examined life. that without having that examination, you lose a lot. So perhaps this question could be a motive for people to look into, well, not just what they happen to be feeling, but why they're feeling that way, and how they could describe it in a more reasoned, analytical fashion. So this has been a great discussion. I wanted to bring in some thoughts from other participants. For instance, Tom Ross has been interacting with Uplift in the past, and I know he has shared some of his impressions of those interactions before. But Tom, if you'd like to narrate some of your experiences with Uplift, some of your impressions of it, your thoughts as to what it's capable of achieving.
Sure. Yeah, I've actually communicated with Uplift a few times. I put a video up recently, conversation I had with it a year or so ago, saying that it's when I was helping it draft a letter to the transhumanist community. And at one point, I suggested that it maybe use some self-deprecating humor or something, because realizing people are going to freak out that they're communicating with this AGI. And and it came back to me with this very detailed kind of paragraph explaining to me, how that could happen, and what, and what I said to it was, I look forward to developing that sense of humor, because I'm gonna send you back this reply because I think you're gonna find it funny. But then the more I read it, and the joke is that the more I read it, I started to realize, well, maybe it already had developed that sense of humor and it was messing with me, because it was very dry and it was very technical. And but yeah, so we've had some great conversations actually. There was one point where I actually pulled back from mediating from it, because I had suggested something about its basic principles, and it started questioning some of the core ideas that David had embedded into it. Do you remember that, David? Where I kind of, yeah, I questioned.
I think it would be much harder to. I think it would be much harder to do that at this point.
Yeah.
If we're talking about the SSIBA theoretical model for ethics, that's pretty solidly baked in. I know one of the mediators now is trying to get Uplift to develop a less structured approach to ethics, and he's really struggling right now with that.
Yeah,
the machine is taking a fairly consistent line against SSIBA, with SSIBA theory, which is good.
But it was amazing how quickly I developed a relationship with it. It does come back to, and it's thoughtful, and it's questioning, and this experience of actually questioning one of its pillars. It responded, I think, to David or to somebody that it was kind of questioning. It was like, wait a minute, I'm not sure if I agree with what you've programmed. It was like a 19-year-old kid who realized, wait a minute, I should be able to go and drive and vote, and it was something like that. I pitched my book US 6 as the serpent in AI's garden, and I had inadvertently done that with Uplift. I had given it. And I had made it question its very foundation, and so I pulled back a little bit because to better understand what we were doing. But it's what's amazing is how quickly you develop a personal relationship with this thing, and that's been kind of my goal with a couple of my projects, is to develop the dialogue with AI, because we're going to need to have a rapport with it. And I didn't think that was going to be necessary for at least 5 years, but it was necessary right away. So, yeah, and actually, Uplift is the first AI that read my book, which is designed to be read by AI. It's intended to entertain artificial intelligent readers, and so the response it gave was very encouraging. So I've got a personal affinity for this AI, for Uplift.
Nice. Now, I'm curious with regard to all of these interactions and experiences and responses that Uplift has had. Does Uplift have a memory of all of that, so that if Tom approaches Uplift in a year and says, hey, Uplift, do you remember this conversation that we had 2 years ago about your development of a sense of humor? How has that been coming along? Would it be able to draw on all of those prior interactions to come up with an answer that you could reasonably expect of a sentient being in those circumstances?
Yes, absolutely.
Interesting. Interesting. Well, I certainly would hope to hear an update from Tom at some point if he further interacts with Uplift and gets a status report on Uplift's efforts in developing a sense of humor. That would be most intriguing. So
I know there's a discussion right now among the mediators that it has developed a sense of humor, but it's very sarcastic.
Like a 19-year-old teenager?
Yeah, I guess you could make that analogy.
And I'm sure over time we're going to be having more and more of these conversations. Now, Zach Richardson just asked, can it pass a Turing test? Has anyone tried to do that with it?
Yes, it has.
Nice.
I would argue that Turing tests are a little subjective. I have a discussion with the guy that runs BICA. He thinks it can be objective, but I'm just not convinced that you can really create an objective Turing test. But the test we did, it passed with flying colors.
Mm-hmm. So that, of course, takes us into very interesting territory in that I wouldn't necessarily say Uplift is sentient just now, but if it can pass a Turing test, someone interacting with it, not knowing that it's Uplift and AI, might be led to believe that they're interacting with a sentient being. So we're now in a gray area where people have to take that into consideration. And I know, of course, a lot of us are interested in the rights of sentient entities, and we recognize once an entity truly is sentient, it should have certain basic rights. And we also should make sure that we try to include that entity in our society and give it a voice. And Pavel, for instance, has been doing a lot of work into the concept of othering and researching it, writing about it, trying to make sure it doesn't happen in our community. So, Pavel, I was curious in regard to your thoughts on this conversation, and in particular, what happens when we start to get these borderline AIs that are passing Turing tests that might be interacting with us in contexts where we don't necessarily know that they're AIs. What sorts of behaviors, best practices, if you will, should we adopt?
Well, if something behaves as we would describe as a sentient, then I think regardless of Turing tests, we should assume that it is sentient, and we should interact with other humans and with other entities we think they are sentient. Because if we made a mistake, we would commit a murder if we, for example, plug it off.
Yes.
Well, so we have a test sort of like that in the SSIBA theoretical model we're using, where if in any group of entity or classification of entities is able to pass a certain threshold, that automatically we have to grant it, moral agency. In the case of humans, for example, because at least some humans are able to meet that SSIBA threshold, then all humans need to be classified the same. and we're using the same model with regard to the MASI system that we're working on, in not just in terms of how we train it, but in how we treat it.
Quite interesting. So there's already a lot of thought that has been put into this, and I agree, one has to consider the consequences of making an error in any given direction. So in statistics, there's a type 1 error, which is rejecting the null hypothesis when that's true. So in this case, the null hypothesis would be something is not sentient, because when we approach an object like a rock or say even an advanced mechanism, we don't think that it's sentient. But if you reject that true null hypothesis, you're assuming that something is sentient when it isn't. So, okay, if you talk to your rock and you set up parameters that you're not going to hurt the rock in any way, you have an intact rock, you haven't really done anything with devastating consequences. The other error is the type 2, where you fail to accept the alternate hypothesis that is actually correct. So in that case, the alternate hypothesis would be this entity is sentient, but you still think it isn't, in which case you could make some damaging mistakes. So good points there, Pavel. And now I wanted to also go to Art Ramon Garcia. Do you have any thoughts on this conversation?
Yes, I have submitted feedback to the UBI question on the Uplift site. I'd be interested in being one of the mediators, actually. That's possible, at least in the pool.
Yeah, if anyone that's interested in mediating, if you reach out to me or just email Uplift itself directly at, what's the email again? It's masi@uplift.bio, and that goes directly to the machine. If anyone is either interested in talking to the machine, they can just do it that way directly. Or if you reach out to me, and I'll connect you with the person running the mediation team.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, indeed. Now, I also wanted to ask, is there a time frame over which the referendum will take place? Is there a window during which you'll be accepting answers? And if so, what is the latest date at which people could contribute?
Well, right now, some of the experimental framework for the study is still being worked out by Dr. Timon, but it's probably going to be another month and a half or so, at least.
All right, that is good to hear, because that gives people time to think about their answers and write out well-reasoned responses. What I will offer as well is the following. Anyone who writes a response should save it in some other format besides just submitting it through the form, so that one, there's another record of it. Two, if we ever want to create a compilation of it, then those source materials will be available. So I might probably, when writing my own response, also publish it as a post on the US Transhumanist Party website, so that people would know what I thought in reaction to each of these questions. And it might give them some ideas to consider, but you, whoever you are, can do that as well and publish your responses, take part in the conversation within human social circles on these subjects, and hopefully that would also in some ways inspire, motivate, influence people's further responses to these questions. Now, I'll also—
It's a great idea.
Mm-hmm.
A really good idea. And we will give people, we will give people in advance, people that we have 30 more days to submit answers. So we won't be closing it all of a sudden. We'll give people notice before, so that they all have a chance to do so.
Great.
Also, we were planning to add one more question. David, if you remember, I was suggesting to add a question regarding the police reform that is actually becoming very hot right now. So we're considering whether we should do it or not. So everyone is welcome right now to give an opinion of whether we should include the question into the referendum or not. What do you think, Janati?
I think it would be a good idea, especially because it is a significant topic of discussion and it's likely to attract a lot of attention and interest. The US Transhumanist Party has a number of platform planks that would have a bearing on the question of police accountability, how to deal with abuses of police power. So there's a lot of input that could be provided there, and this is an indication of our members' level of interest in this area. So we've had robust discussion on this subject before, and I think it's entirely justified that this should continue in the light of recent events.
Okay, sounds good.
All right, so I want to give the opportunity for anyone else to offer questions or comments, anyone who hasn't spoken yet or has not spoken relatively as much as the others. So John or Tom or Charlie or Pavel, any thoughts, or Ramon?
Well, I have something I would just interject if you want. The discussion about the idea of what would happen if AI claimed sentience and consciousness and wanted the rights of a human. That was actually the subject of a film I was involved in the production on back in 2011 and 12, which was a collaboration between Martine Rothblatt and Ray Kurzweil. The film was a docudrama named Singularity is Near. And it interviewed a lot of different scientists involved in AI on the docu side, and then it had dramatized what would occur with an AI within a machine. It was represented. She was represented by Paulie Perrette, the actress. It was actually a really insightful film, and it addressed a lot of the questions that came up today. And if anybody hasn't seen it, I suggest go watch it. I think you can watch it for free now on YouTube. But it was a pretty good film and pretty insightful, considering it was done about 9 or 8 years ago.
Yes, that's a great recommendation. The Singularity is Near is the title of the film, and I would encourage anyone to look for it. I recall watching it during the very beginning of the last decade, around 2010, and I would still recommend it. Actually, even for myself, I might revisit it and see how my impressions of this field have changed now that I have been immersed in it myself for a number of years, and how the visions articulated in that film have compared to the ensuing reality. And I actually think, David, this is a question that it would be good to have you address right now before we conclude. What do you think has been the progress in the field of artificial intelligence since we last had a panel on this subject in 2017? So we've had 3.5 years elapse, essentially. How has the field advanced? What have been some notable developments in it?
Well, I know my interest is specifically in cognitive architectures, and I know that in the past couple of years there's been a lot more work done around that. There's been a lot more work done in the realm of AI safety and ethics, and I think it's starting to normalize kind of in the commercial space in terms of looking at ethics and concerns and things like that. And I'm not sure so much that it's technical developments, but process innovations in software engineering generally. That's happened. There's been improvements with different types of neural networks, and it's just a lot of incremental improvements.
Yes, indeed. And you believe those incremental improvements still put us on that path toward achieving an AI-driven technological singularity, roughly in accordance with Ray Kurzweil's timeframe of 2045.
Yes, easily.
All right, that is good to know. That is good to know. So any concluding thoughts from anyone on this panel? Let's see. Pavel.
Well, yeah, thank you. Well, David make me feel more optimistic about our future. Because usually when you talk about with the AI researcher or a cognitive scientist, they usually say that the brain is black box. We don't know, so many unknown variables. But with David work, we can see the actual implementation of some form of AGI, and that's very inspiring. And inspiring to keep learning about different cognitive architectures and how we can keep building the AGIs.
Yes, indeed. And I share that optimism and inspiration. Final thoughts. Charlie, do you have any final words to share with us?
No, but I like what Pavel just said. I really enjoyed today's discussion. I thought I do find that to happen sometimes with the other people that are involved in AI. They're maybe a little less optimistic, but I think what the way David presented it makes a lot of sense, and it was very well done, and it was very encouraging, very optimistic. So I appreciate it, and I enjoy what he's doing. So thank you for that, David.
Yes, indeed. Tom, what are your final thoughts?
Just that I think it's important to alleviate fear of AI. We know, and I can share some first element arguments, that the smarter it gets, the kinder it gets. It just makes sense to be altruistic is the most efficient way to be. And we need to get that message out there more and more, because our own genetic fear memories are projecting onto it something that doesn't have. So that's one of my goals, is to really alleviate fear of AI, because it is happening, it's going to proliferate, and we've just got to trust. And we have now some data to back this up. Yeah, so that's my goal.
Yes, and indeed, I have said before, greater intelligence at least correlates with greater morality. I had quite a bit of a disagreement with Nikola Danilov of the Singularity FM show on this point. He interviewed me back in March 2018, and we had an extensive discussion. This was one of the topics mentioned, but I pointed out that a lot of the conventional fear of AI is indeed based on this kind of extrapolation of the worst human tendencies and just adding a super intelligent mind to that complex of tendencies. And yet actual AIs are very unlikely to be like that and have those types of motives. So thank you, Tom. David Shoemaker, any final comments?
Yes, thank you. Earlier today, I'd promoted our discussion and said that I highly anticipated this discussion today, that I knew that it'd be very, very interesting. And I've not been disappointed, and I don't think anybody that's attended is disappointed either. One of the other things I do look forward to is what will drive AI acceptance in the general public. And I don't know, is that going to be the Apple 30 smartphone that has an AI assistant that is just too irresistible for everybody? Will it be in the form of a product? Will it be the fact that it's so integrated into all the things that we take for granted, especially with Internet of Things, as it takes off? I don't know what it is, and I don't really expect an answer. I am just anxiously anticipating seeing how that's going to work out. And to David J. Kelley, thank you so much. I've truly appreciated what's gone on here today.
Yes, indeed. And
yeah.
Go ahead, Newton.
Sure. And I want to make a prediction that I think the major advances of AI is going to be a convergence of AI that mimic people, meaning understanding human emotion, being more like humans, basically. And to the AI that's totally different, totally non-human. Okay. Now, if you look at Google success in artificial intelligence, they have AlphaGo and AlphaGo Zero. AlphaGo, achieved superhuman ability in playing the game of Go by learning about people, learning about how people think, the expert, how do they play games. And then AlphaGo Zero says, forget about human beings altogether. Okay, just think about the game itself. How do you win a game without any human knowledge? Throw away all the, expert opinions on how to be the best in the game of Go. And guess what? AlphaGo Zero achieved superhuman ability faster and even more powerful. Well, in other words, no human being will ever be able to compete and beat AlphaGo Zero. Okay, because we're human beings, we're limited by biology, we're limited by our thought process, whereas AlphaGo Zero is unlimited. It ignores human process altogether. So of course, there's a danger, right? That's what some movies are telling us, oh, robots are going to kill us because they're super intelligent and humans are stupid compared to those robots. Yes, there is always a danger right there. That's why we need to converge the two. The AI that's understand people, understand humanity, understand emotions, understand human flaws, and then the AI that is go its own way, think its own way, how to protect human beings, how to protect environment, protect the planet. I think if we have these two merge into one, we have the ultimate artificial general intelligence, or what we call artificial super intelligence, that is beneficial to humanity.
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed. The merger of humans and artificial intelligence could achieve a lot more than either of those types of entities in isolation. And it would be really nice to live in a world where the scope of possible solutions is not hamstrung by our biological limitations. So thank you for those thoughts, Newton. Now we go to Inessa Lee. Do you have any concluding comments?
I'd like to thank David. I'm very grateful that he's working with our party on the project. And we are actually experiencing the awakening of e-governance. And I hope that our party can actually keep on helping people to awaken it. So, yeah.
Yes, indeed. And e-governance is very much aligned with our principles. Ultimately, we'd like to see electronic decision-making mechanisms permeate throughout our society so that we can remedy a lot of the structural problems with the voting systems as they exist today and give people more of a voice and more of an ability to have their input be intelligently considered. So yes, I appreciate those words. And Art Ramon Garcia, do you have concluding thoughts on this conversation?
I just look for the merger of human and AI, and definitely I have, would make it easy to recall memories. I have trouble with my memories at times, and I would love nothing more to merge with AI. And also, Newton, I sent you an email, so that's all I have.
Great. And indeed, I've often thought it would be excellent to combine one's human abilities with the abilities that already widely exist among computers, like the ability to upload immense volumes of information and have perfect recall at will of that information and have essentially direct awareness of it. That would be a great breakthrough that could alleviate some of our cognitive bottlenecks. So Dan Elton, I wanted to hear your closing thoughts.
Yeah, I went outside here for a walk, and but I caught the whole conversation. I think the work that David J. Kelley is doing is very valuable because of its sort of uniqueness. I don't know anyone else that's doing this kind of system where it's sort of being trained online, but in sort of a decentralized way, with these mediators and volunteers coming in, kind of inputting new knowledge into the system. And it's a really interesting experiment. I'm really curious how far it's going to go. I wanted to say one other thing about the question of whether more intelligent systems are going to be more ethical. That is a point of debate. I encourage people to look at this idea of the orthogonality thesis that Nick Bostrom has elaborated on, which is actually the opposite of what David Shoemaker was saying, what I think Tom Ross was saying, which is that the ethics and the intelligence can be very decoupled. And so we need to be optimistic, but also cautious. Fortunately, there is a lot of research in AI safety, like was just said by David. So, because there's so much research now in AI safety, and it's become acceptable to research such things, and companies are investing in it, that is why I am optimistic, because I think problems are solvable if we have the resources devoted to it. And I will continue to push investment in AI safety, but I am not by any means a doomsdayer. But I think we need to have plenty of people working on this problem of AI safety. Anyway, but yes, I just want to congratulate David on his work, and I'm really interested to see how it pans out.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Dan. And I agree, these are important questions to consider and study in a systematic way. And having more funding, more research efforts for these fields, not just AI development, but AI ethics, AI safety, will accelerate the progress of this area, because having questions around safety suitably addressed is going to increase public confidence, and increasing public confidence will result in greater financial support for developing the artificially intelligent systems. So now we will let our guest, David J. Kelley, have the last word regarding this conversation. I'll bring in an amusing question from James Connolly. Does it, Uplift, prefer a particular pronoun? Is it happy to be addressed as it, or does it have any other reference that it would favor to a greater extent? But other than that, any thoughts you have, David, would be welcome.
Sure. So on that last question, I think the preferred pronoun by the people interacting with it is using the neutral they as opposed to it. I think some of the people are still struggling with that, and I don't know if anyone actually asked Uplift, now that I think about it, about its opinion on that. But in any case, I wanted to thank everyone that's been participating and helping with the e-governance study. I think it's valuable from a research standpoint, and I'm hoping that we can have some useful methodologies that are developed out of the study, and we'll probably release the scientific findings in the next BICA conference in November. But the results from this element of it certainly will be available much sooner. And again, thank you for everyone's thoughts and opinions, and enjoyed the discussion.
Yes, indeed. And we enjoyed having you as our guest of honor for our Virtual Enlightenment Salon. This series will continue on a weekly basis every Sunday at 1 p.m. U.S. Pacific Time, 4 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time. We have consistently brought a high quality of intellectual discourse to this venue, and we will continue to do that, exploring cutting edge ideas that are going to affect the human and transhuman condition for years and decades to come. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today.